We met at IMD. He's a shader writer. He's TD lighters and all around good person and engineer. And he's going to talk about, he's going to take from where Arkel left it off this morning. In essence, if you have a light map, what do you do with it, and what is the advantages of having an unclipped light map for material setup or shot production? Then we have a small change. The speaker, the second speaker, but it's a good change. The second speaker, Wayne from WEDA, couldn't come, but we have Alexander Keller, who's going to talk about biased rendering and he's going to basically take out some myth about what it means to have Monte Carlo rendering and show all those different techniques for resolving different light transports and how we do it now technically. He's originally, obviously, from Mental Images. He's the main architect over there of Mental Ray and iRay, and he's now at NVIDIA because they were purchased. And then we go to Stefan Steinbach from Lucasfilm. He's been at Lucasfilm Animation for the last 5 years as a senior engineer, and he's gonna basically kind of round off this arrays of talk in a way, because he's done a survey a few years later of the transition that had happened at ILM and Lucasfilm Animation to physically based rendering. So it's a survey from actual artists and what they think about techniques like that, what they miss or what they like or whatever. It's going to be very interesting for me to hear. And then Ted Burge will come back and do the part 2 of his presentation, the one he started this morning. He will focus more about in-house tools from where he left it off this morning. So without much further ado, here's Christos. Thank you for coming.
All right, thank you. So how many of you were here for Arkel's talk? Show hands, okay. So we kind of continue on that. It'll be a bit of a summary from his talk, and then we'll go further in. So I just break it up into a few parts, this talk. So just an introduction. So we rely on the captured HDRI maps to drive realistic lighting responses in our environment for shading. And many of these maps, like we talked about, contain clip high values, especially the sun, which like the sun, as Arkel, if you saw his talk, has like some really high values in the RGB, but a lot of the maps that you find in production are clipped. So you get like an inconsistency in material settings, and you have unrealistic, just basically response from the materials. And one major source for the clipping is if you had like a non-important sampled shader setup requiring too many samples, you have like too many samples to basically deal with the diffuse. And with RenderMan's new, like latest version 16, we show how we can like deal with that. So what is a clipped HDR? So we can take a look into Photoshop and see like what an unclipped HDR is, and we have like values for the sun. So is that easy to see up there? So if this is one of the HDRs from Arkel, and if we zoom in here and really take the exposure down, and we take a look at those values, they're about, you can see they're about like 34,000. And if we look at the gray card, this HDR texture has to be kind of gained up to a value of 2 to get the gray card in like 0.18. So that'll be actually like 64,000 for the sun. So keep in mind the rest of the image is like more or less between 0 and 1. So that's like pretty high values in there when we have an unclipped sun. So just gonna go back to our slides. So the values are like around like 64,000, and that's about 16 stops. So 2 to the power of 16 is about 64,000. So those are like pretty high values. And then we can have other kind of image viewers to find that. So this is mplay, and you can sample kind of like the values there, and you can see that they're about 34,000, 32, etc. So one way to basically clip them, and we'll talk about later why they do get clipped, is taking it into Photoshop and doing just like an 8-bit. Can bring it to 8-bit, and I just showed like a sample here, and now you can see that all goes between like 0 and 1, and the sun is 1. So I guess like what would be in a traditional setup with traditional shaders, does anybody know what would be wrong with like using these unclipped maps the way they are? Like, why didn't we always have like unclipped maps? Noise. Yeah, noise is definitely one of the things, and it, as we'll see later, it produces those artifacts. So I said also what could go wrong when shading and ray tracing the environment. So this is like an example scene we're going to use, and that's fully ray traced. There's like no light sources there. But yeah, so this is what happens if you use like an unclipped map. We get in the diffuse AOV, because the specular AOV was fine, but in the diffuse AOV, we just have like a lot of these really high contrast areas in the map. We just get a lot of these artifacts in there. And that's why it was common to basically clip them, because we just didn't have shaders that could really solve that. Reflection AOV is fine, because in this case it's like a pure mirror reflection, so we just have like a cone angle of 0 and like one sample. And then another parking lot HDR by RCal that we take a look at. And then in these values we have not as high as the sun, but still pretty high, like 24,000 for the bright light sources. So if we look back at these ones, so still pretty high. And that's about 14.5 stops. I just wanted to show like another HDR, and then that same scene, we've got the noise issues there. So given that we'd be like ray tracing, and typically in production we might use like 64 samples or 128 or 256, can anyone guess, like, if we were using these unclipped maps, how many samples that we would need to actually get rid of that noise? Given that normally it's like 128, 256. Did you say 10,000? Wow. Oh, okay. So probably around 10,000. I didn't actually test this, but given just kind of the number of samples that we take, it's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood. So clearly that's not only like not production savvy, but it's not anything savvy. Like, you don't even want to run that on a small asset. So this makes it inconceivable to use these unclipped maps in like a traditional ray traced lighting solution. And then the map is clipped, and we get, so that's like another map. So in this case, we clip the map, and we use this for diffuse. That's indirect diffuse AOV, and it's clamped to 8-bit. And this is actually blurred a little bit, but this is actually fine for production. So this is something that you would see. It's like a nice diffuse AOV, and we've clipped the map, and we can use this. But however, this leads to like problems that we talk about later. So just to give an overview, we have our pure specular mirror reflection, and this is our kind of diffuse sampling. So in our mirror reflection, we just have, like I said, like a cone angle of 0 and just one sample. And if we put in our HDR in there just to kind of see what's going on, we can see that the reflection is just sampling like one area, so the bright spots are okay, but the diffuse is sampling over like that 180 degree or pi radians, so we get the whole hemisphere. And if we have those really bright spots all over there, it's going to lead to those noise values. So in this traditional IBL approach, we saw the problems of the unclipped raw maps on the diffuse with a reasonable number of samples, and solution one was converting it to 8-bit, and another solution is using like a convolved map. And the reason that we may want to use solutions two instead of one is just because it's not conceivable also just to even like ray trace everything in the environment. So we take that HDR, and we can actually use like a really small version of it and just blur it, and then that's what our diffuse looks like when we look up when we do an environment call in PRMan. So it's like a really simple call. So that environment call essentially blurs that map, and we're just doing like a single lookup into it, so it's not really expensive. But what's missing from that is there's obviously like no shadowing, so we have to simulate not necessarily like a directional shadow, but we do an ambient occlusion, and we multiply it, and that's the ambient occlusion. So again, our first solution was just doing an indirect diffuse. That's the shader source code. And then that's our final rendering equation. So we just have an indirect diffuse that samples everything, and we multiply it by the color. And then the other solution that we looked at with that convolved map, we just did an environment call. So that was a really simple call in RenderMan. And then we, of course, had to do our occlusion to multiply. And then our final equation. It's a convolved map, which gets multiplied by the occlusion, and then our paint. And then our ray trace reflection, again, it was like a mirror reflection. Go back to that. So we just did a gather call. And so those are like the traditional approaches. So we obviously saw like a problem with the diffuse, and that was our goal of getting like diffuse with unclipped maps. And we looked at like the two different environment and indirect diffuse calls and our gather. So part 2, we want to look at multiple importance sampling, PRMN 16, and using like the raw unclipped maps in that kind of an environment. So what is importance sampling? So this is our traditional sampling, but importance sampling, we want to take a look at our specular BRDF, and the thickness of it denotes where most of our reflection is going to go on a given material. So if you look at it in this way, this kind of outlines, this is like our reflection direction. And that's where like most of our from the material, most of our information is going to come from this direction. So we want to basically just bias what we look up in that area. And then if you look at it from the point of view of the light, because back here we were looking at the material, and here we're looking at the light sources. So where are the light sources? So our light sources are HDR images, and we've got like different regions where the lights may be, and based on that BRDF, we're looking in this direction for reflection. So, you know, what are the brightest light sources in those areas? So what are the bright spots? What are the high contrast spots? And then you have probabilities assigned to the lights in the BRDF, and then it does a more efficient sampling in the direction. So the probabilities are weighed. So in Pixar RenderMan implementation, we have new methods. We have the lighting method, which does all direct lighting, diffuse and specular through this multiple importance sampling. And we can share light sampling between them. And we can trigger the secondary transports, so refraction and scatter. And then our diffuse lighting has the secondary diffuse. You can specify the importance sampling strategy and do the diffuse lighting at ray hits and the rebounds. And the light sampling is only for the secondary diffuse illumination. So this is an outline of basically like the new kind of shading paradigm. And then very important is the radiosity cache, which is new in PRMN 16, and that does a lot of speed ups for diffuse. And the specular lighting does the view dependent secondary components, the specular lighting at the ray hits, the rebounces, and the light sampling, and the diffuse at the hits come from that cache. So let's see it in action. So this was just want to look back at, you know, original setup, and this is what we were getting in the final beauty. And obviously, just wanted to show like a different viewpoint. And again, this is our diffuse component is just creating lots of little sampling artifacts. And this is that same scene. Now we've dropped it into like a physically plausible setup, and you can see that this surface. This is the plausible matte shader. This is like a glass shader. So we have plausible matte again. We've got a reflection. And then those similar materials are like on the van. So the big thing here is like we just don't get those artifacts, right? Because it's using multiple importance sampling. On the diffuse materials, it's importance sampling the lights. So we just basically got rid of, you know, those issues that we saw here. And again, this is like the latest PRMan, like 16, and using those physically plausible shaders. So that solved like that problem, but there's also, there's more to it. There's uh, something about like tuning the materials and having them consistent across kind of all different lighting environments. And we'll see that if you do a physically plausible shading setup and use the unclipped maps, you can really get good materials, which is really important in production because as you drop it into different light sources, it's going to hold. But when you're clipping the maps like we saw before, even though we had like a nice image and we modified our values, that just doesn't hold across like all lighting environments. So the shaders, I'm not going to like dive into the code, but just to outline some of the ones that we're using again, it's like plausible matte, plausible dielectric, plausible conductor, and there's like a glass shader in there. And plausible dielectric, so conductor is like a metal, so it's a conducting material, and the dielectrics are non-conducting materials. So in that example of the render, because it's kind of like a car paint, it is a metal, but it's painted and there's like some gloss over it. So it's like a clear coat, so I use like a dielectric for that. And the way that dielectric mixes in between the specular and the diffuse is based on Fresnel. So we just mix in, we find out what the Fresnel components are, and then we mix the specular and diffuse based on that. So in the plausible dielectric, we have the Fresnel multiplied by the diffuse. We have the specular. So that's just like a render of the Fresnel AOV. So we can see how it mixes in stronger reflection on the grazing angles. So that summary of section 2 is looking at the new physically plausible shading in PRMan and looking at a render of our scene. And we solved basically that problem with the diffuse having no artifact. So if we go back to that, we solved that issue there. And we talked about just some of the shaders that we're using there. So in the next section, so now that it looks fine with the diffuse, etc. So like how do the materials like hold across different environments? And if we look at the clipped HDRs, they're going to lead to material settings that fail to hold. So this was the one that we saw before. If we drop in a map that was clipped, so in the beginning, I showed how we would clip the map just to get like a nice diffuse response. So if we drop that map in there, because in production, you'll have different maps. So obviously, like the settings don't hold. I mean, that plausible matte is just like really dark. That reflection is just really washed out. The material settings need a lot of work. So, if we go into the shader and there's various attributes, our gains, our specular gains, or diffuse gains, and there's a lot of different attributes, obviously, that we can modify the material to get it kind of up in the same area. And obviously, it'll never be the same as the physically, the unclipped maps, the physically based ones. So we get a little bit closer. Our highlight's like a lot stronger, and even though that's not the same, like the overall brightness is a lot higher. So we kind of like, our goal again is to match this as close as we can. So, we might tune this material for, in a look development environment. We decide that we like that, and let's put that into different lighting environments. So this is that raw seminary that we saw, and this is the unclipped HDR. Looks a little bit dark on the projector. It should be overall a little bit lighter. However, again, we see that everything kind of works and sits together, and our plausible matte is just kind of like a middle gray and kind of sits well in the scene. But if we take that saved material that we modified before and drop it into a different lighting environment, it looks like this. So it's not even close. So, had we tuned it in a physically, with physically based shaders, out of the box, it just holds in a totally different lighting environment. And this is like really important for production because, you want it to hold across different environments for different shots, etc. So we can see that it just, even though we tuned it, to one environment, it just kind of fails when you drop it in somewhere else. And if we try a different environment, a different HDR, this is the physically based, again, just the default materials, and it holds, and it That plausible mat kind of matches the ground, etc. And there's our modified material that we did before. So again, it just does not hold across all environments. And this is the dusk map. And then same thing. So you get the idea. I just wanted to show it in different maps. So it just doesn't hold all the way across. So like, what if we took out the sun from the HDR? If we have like our little dome here, and that's what we're originally sampling in that raw seminary, and we've got our unclipped sun. Like, what if we unclipped it, we took it out, and then just either placed it on a card or like replaced it in a light source? Does anybody know like what advantages there could be to that? Like, why would we want to do that? It can change the light direction, that's right. Yeah, so it's like isolated into like a different light source. So you're kind of, like we talked about the importance sampling earlier. So you're kind of like doing that because you're cutting out like the really bright stuff. And you're placing it onto like an actual light. So the renderer just like knows that there's a bright light source and it can focus on that. You can move it around. But you could also sample the environment. You have a certain number of samples for a high contrast HDR, but you can take your samples down a lot if you've taken out the bright light source and put it somewhere else, because then you don't really have a high contrast image anymore, right? So you can maybe take those samples down to like 16 from like 256, so that could be a lot more efficient. So here's again our original image. And we've taken the light out completely, so you can see on the chrome ball here, there's no sun. That's where it was before. And then we can replace it. Now, I just did, that card doesn't actually mean anything, I just wanted to show the direction. So we replaced it with like a plausible environment light, which is a plausible sunlight. That's like another physically plausible shader. And overall, it's still a little bit darker. I mean, there's like intensities there that you can match to bring it higher up. But you can see how you can take it out, maybe lower your sampling on the actual dome and then move that light around and do different things with it. And that's kind of especially helpful with, the sunlight, because it's so isolated and there's no other bright spots in the scene. So if we want to take a look, at the rib file in RenderMan, this uses all like the new shaders and the new settings. And we've got our shaders are like that's the plausible matte shader, and then those lights are set up. We have the plausible area light in here, and we also have the environment light. So that you can see how this scene is set up with like the new shaders. And there should be a sunlight in here too. So there's a plausible sunlight. So if we go back, again, that was our original. We removed the light source, added the sunlight. So for this section, we used our physically plausible scene and the multiple lighting environments to demonstrate how the material setup holds across. So if you're using any maps that are clipped and you're tuning those materials, they're just not going to hold across like different environments. And you can imagine like how in a production that could just be a nightmare, because you're constantly, there really is no like kind of ground truth in that way, because you're constantly like reworking your materials. But if you have the shaders that can handle these unclipped maps, as you go across different lighting environments, it holds like across. And then we looked at how the clipped HDRIs lead to material settings that fail to hold across all the lighting environments. And we just looked at obviously like the new shaders that come with RenderMan. So we had the plausible matte, the dielectric, etc. And then we talked about Fresnel mixing in the plausible dielectric, that's how you're mixing between like the specular and the diffuse. And then we talked about cutting out the bright sun from the HDR to be replaced by the sunlight. I also did some experiments with placing that. So we used like the plausible sunlight, but that texture that you can cut out, you can also put it on an area light. But we were just, because it was like so really hot and we were still getting a little bit of artifacts and PRMan. So we're just like looking into that. So I didn't want to show that because there could be some bugs there with actually like putting that texture on an area light. Make sure I do. May have it here. So we're getting a little bit of artifacts there. Again, it's kind of brighter on my screen, so it's hard to see, but there were some limitations there with the texture lookup. Just kind of ran through that quickly. Yeah, we can do more questions. So I'd like to thank Arkel for the Unclipped HDRs. And Jason did our van model, and the original car painter was by my colleague Brad. And special thanks to Christos and the organizers, and Pixar's RenderMan team was helpful in doing some of these tests. So is there any questions? Okay, do we have a microphone? Okay.
What was the question? Hi. So what's wrong in repeating the procedure that you just outlined for the sun? So basically searching through the HDR map for bright spots and replacing them with uniform light sources and keep repeating that, like the median cut approach a few years ago?
But what's wrong with cutting it out?
Yeah. Why not do that for all bright parts?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it particularly works well with the sun because it's, like I said, it was isolated, and the rest of that map is like primarily between 0 and 1. But if you look at like some of the other HDRs, and you've got like night lights and you've got a lot of different lights, it just kind of becomes impractical to cut all of those out and manage them. But also when you are pasting them like on actual area lights, it does get really expensive to render them because the shadowing for the area lights starts getting pretty intensive. So in some of the tests, and like the number of area lights cut out, like 3 was kind of the maximum you wanted to do, and then the render started getting pretty crazy. So there's kind of like a limit there. You don't want to do 10 or more. But yeah, and also another advantage I didn't point out was if you have kind of things that are spatially important. So like the sunlight is assumed to be obviously like really far away at infinity. However, if you've got your object moving around, Arkel touched on this earlier in his talk, if you have the actual area lights with the light sources cut out, and if they are placed at the correct position, so they have to be the right size and the correct distance from that object, you'll get a better response because the solid angle math on the HDR that's captured obviously works ideally like where it was captured, like where that where that capture happened. So the advantage of having larger light sources put on area lights, you can really like spatially place them and get a better response. But yeah, there's a limit to it gets quite expensive computationally, putting a lot of area lights with textures on them. Any other questions? Over there?
Question too. We have the microphone, yeah. You asked about medium cut. I mean, I think medium cut is one algorithm to import and sample the environment map. So you can do that. But I think what Christos was presenting is that if you do just a subset of this medium cut by hand, potentially on one environment map, and you tune your parameters for your materials to what you extracted, unfortunately, you end up sort of baking in your materials the light properties that you extracted in a way, which are not completely physical at that stage. And what it means is that you can't transfer those material properties into a different environment automatically anymore. They're not going to work. They're not canonized. They're not proper. So it's not so much that we can't get it to converge with medium cathode. It's going to work fine, obviously, and in fact, this might be the way it works behind the scene. There's many algorithms happening there. But, just want to say.
So, hi. My question is, renderers that use BRDFs like V-Ray and Mental Ray and FMX, for instance, do they have problems with unclipped HDRIs as long as they do not use importance sampling?
Yeah. I mean, the tests that I've done here are like primarily in PRMan, but yeah, absolutely. If you're not importance sampling, again, you're going to be either you're not concentrating your samples in any specific areas, and in particular for the diffuse that we saw, in that case you're not importance sampling the BRDF, but you are the lights. So doing like a full sample, 180 degrees, you're going to have a lot of noise issues there.
Hi, can you say something about the implementation of the Fresnel? Is it pure Fresnel, or is it something like an approximation like Schlick or so?
Yeah, it's a Schlick approximation. So if you look inside some of the physically plausible shaders, sorry, I can't see. Where's the? Okay, right there. There's a bright light. If you look inside the physically plausible shaders that come with PRMan, and then in this case we were looking at the dielectric, but there's a Fresnel header file, and in there it's like Schlick approximation. Anybody else? All right. Thank you.